Saddam Hussein was the president of Iraq and a brutal dictator. For 11 years, he had enforced a violent regime that murdered and tortured without hesitation. He'd built up the fourth largest army in the world, with over 1 million troops. But his regime was in serious trouble. Not least because an 8-year war with his neighbor Iran had left him with a mountain of debt. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had invaded Kuwait, putting nearly half the world's oil within his reach.
Iraq's army shocked the world by invading its neighbor, Kuwait.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait.
What has happened is a total violation of international law.
Please raise their hand.
The United Nations condemned the invasion and called on Saddam to withdraw his troops from Kuwait. But far from withdrawing, there were signs that he might be planning something even bigger. On August the 6th, 1990, just 4 days after Iraq had invaded Kuwait, a top-rank White House team flew to Saudi Arabia to meet King Fahd. They offered to fly in thousands of US troops to defend the kingdom. Within hours, one of the biggest deployments of troops since World War II was underway. In the coming months, troops from over 30 countries would take their place alongside the Americans and British in the Saudi Arabian desert. It was an extraordinary coalition that even included several Arab states like Egypt and Syria, but it was the Americans that dominated.
An Iraqi attack on Saudi Arabia remained a constant fear for the coalition. But it was the stories about the actions of Saddam's army inside Kuwait that outraged world opinion. They brought a reign of terror to Kuwait, including summary executions in the street.
By November 1990, world leaders had run out of patience with Saddam. Although he hadn't attacked Saudi Arabia, he showed no signs of withdrawing from Kuwait. So the UN Security Council passed a new resolution that changed the coalition's mission dramatically.
12 votes in favor, 2 votes against, 1 abstention.
No longer would the coalition just defend Saudi Arabia. If Saddam's troops had not withdrawn from Kuwait in 6 weeks, the coalition would attack and force the Iraqis out. For the US military, it was a daunting prospect. They were haunted by the memories of the United States' last major conflict and knew that they could not afford to make the same mistakes again.
If one American soldier has to go into battle, that soldier will have enough force behind him to win and then get out as soon as possible. This will not be another Vietnam.
Just 2 years earlier, in March 1988, the Iraqi army had attacked a Kurdish village in northern Iraq using a mixture of mustard gas and the nerve agent sarin. 5,000 people were killed and thousands more suffered terrible
But in 1991, soldiers feared they really would have to fight while under chemical attack. Some of them were already suffering heat exhaustion just from wearing gas masks in training. Schwarzkopf knew that if it came to war, the greatest threat to his troops was Iraq's chemical weapons. And he also knew he would have to minimize American and coalition casualties. The key would be to keep his ground troops out of the battle for as long as possible. 1 week before the UN deadline expired, 750,000 coalition troops waited on the battlefield, as the politicians made one last attempt to find a diplomatic solution. The US Secretary of State, James Baker, met Iraq's Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz, in Geneva. Both men knew that tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives were at stake. And James Baker warned the Iraqis not to use chemical weapons, reminding them that America had nuclear bombs. But 7 hours of talks ended in failure.
If Iraq should choose to continue its brutal occupation of Kuwait, Iraq will be choosing a military confrontation which it cannot win and which will have devastating consequences.
But Saddam remained as defiant as ever and promised his people a great victory. He warned that the Americans depended too much on technology. He boasted that Iraq could rely on the bravery and experience of its soldiers. Their faith would defeat the enemy.
Operation Desert Storm had begun. British RAF pilots in low-flying Tornado aircraft carried bombs designed to crater Iraqi runways. The Americans' first target was Iraq's capital. From the rooftops of Baghdad, 3,000 anti-aircraft guns fired into the night. The F-117 stealth bomber was designed to be invisible to radar. But this was its first test in major combat. At exactly 3 a.m., the pilot in the lead aircraft pushed the button and a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb descended on its target. Across the city, the ground shook as 14 more bombs from other stealths hit their targets. The aircraft turned for home. Cruise missiles launched from US warships knocked out the power stations and plunged the city into darkness. Throughout that night and into the following day, American and coalition aircraft continued to attack Iraqi targets, including Saddam Hussein's palaces. At 2 a.m. on January the 18th, 1991, air raid sirens sounded across Israel. They warned of a Scud missile attack from Iraq heading for Tel Aviv, Israel's biggest city.
Saddam Hussein's attack on Israel was an act of ruthless calculation. He hoped Israel would retaliate. If it did, Israel would then appear to be on the same side as the Arab nations in the coalition. From Washington, senior White House officials called the Israeli defense minister, urging him to show restraint. For hours, the whole world held its breath, waiting to see how the Israelis would respond. Under huge pressure from the White House, the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, agreed not to retaliate, at least for the time being. Coalition aircraft began flying around the clock, searching thousands of square miles of empty desert, hoping to spot Iraq's estimated 20 mobile Scud launchers and then destroy them. For the American commander, General Schwarzkopf, it was a tough challenge.
Finding the mobile launchers is like finding a needle in a haystack, as you can well imagine.
Scuds continued to hit Israel, and Washington ordered Schwarzkopf to step up the search. The Scud attacks on Israel went on, but still they failed to break up the coalition, as Saddam hoped. In a further attempt to weaken public support for the war, British pilots John Nichol and John Peters, shot down on the first night, were paraded on Iraqi television. They had been tortured and were forced to denounce the war.
I think this war should be stopped so we can go home. I do not agree on this war with Iraq.
The pictures provoked condemnation across the world and only inflamed Western public opinion against Saddam. Saddam was unable to prevent the air campaign systematically destroying his army. So 2 weeks after the air war began, he ordered an attack that would force the Americans into the risky ground combat they wanted to avoid.
Their movement was watched by an unmanned American spy plane, feeding pictures back to its operator.
What do we have here? Crow. Let's see what they are. Man, this is something. Here we go. Closer, closer. And 2,253 hours. They've crossed the border in Saudi Arabia.
The coalition had complete control of the skies over Kuwait, but not a single aircraft was close enough to stop the Iraqis.
Where's our air? This is ridiculous. Frickin' bomber couldn't ask for any better target than that.
Go for it. Step up a smoke. Yep. Right to the right of that.
Troops from America, Qatar and Saudi Arabia now had to fight their way into the city to regain control.
Arm this missile, I'll shoot it down range. Take that bad boy out.
And when air support finally arrived, they had a decisive advantage.
I certainly would not want to be an Iraqi troop up there. Aircraft are swarming over that battlefield like gnats.
After 2 days of fighting, coalition troops finally regained control. An estimated 38 Iraqis were killed and hundreds more captured, but the coalition had suffered too. In their first taste of ground combat, 43 coalition troops, including 25 US Marines, were killed. For some, it had been a sobering experience.
But with Kafji back in coalition control, world attention turned once again to the air campaign, which was now in its 4th week. Television audiences across the world had become hooked on the extraordinary footage being beamed into their homes around the clock. It was all part of the public relations war. After their experiences in Vietnam, American commanders knew that unfavorable coverage might damage public support for the war. So they carefully managed what was actually seen by the watching world.
Splash. That was an excellent splash.
The American general who commands all the Allied forces in the Gulf has said that Operation Desert Storm has been going according to plan.
The aim was to portray the war as clinical and bloodless, with so-called smart bombs making surgical strikes.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs, right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror,
but the laughter was about to end. In the early hours of February the 13th, 1991, 2 stealth bombers flew towards the Al Amariya bunker in the suburbs of Baghdad on what was supposed to be a routine mission. Shortly after 4:30 a.m., they released 2 laser-guided bombs.
American criminals! Forward the war! Forward the war!
Hundreds had been killed, many of them children. Pictures of the disaster were broadcast around the world.
I miss my wife and my children. Is that fair? Nobody says something to stop this massacre.
It was a terrible mistake. These images of so many dead civilians and their distraught relatives shattered the myth that this was a bloodless war, and it forced Schwarzkopf to curtail the bombing of Iraqi cities for fear of causing more civilian casualties. But the Iraqi army got no such reprieve. The air campaign had battered Iraqi targets for over a month, and still, Saddam had not withdrawn his army from Kuwait. Schwarzkopf knew coalition ground troops would soon have to drive them out, and in preparation, he intensified the airstrikes against the Iraqi front line.
He ordered the Iraqi army to blow up the oil fields of Kuwait. It created scenes of apocalyptic devastation.
Out in the Gulf, the big guns of the US warships began a massive artillery barrage onto the Kuwaiti coastline. But the real attack would come from the ground troops. In front of them, they expected vast minefields, and coalition commanders expected the Marines to be able to penetrate just a few miles into the heavy Iraqi defenses, with as many as 1 in 3 of the Marines being killed or injured. But as the Marines crossed into Kuwait, they were amazed at what happened.
All right.
Hey, let's go! Get up here!
The Marines continued forward into Kuwait. There was little resistance, and nearly everywhere their progress was unopposed. "10 hours into the ground war, at 2:30 p.m, British and American troops began a massive artillery barrage onto the Iraqi positions in front of them. One of their key weapons was the multiple launch rocket system. As the artillery died down, more than 150,000 coalition troops and over 1,500 tanks began their advance.
He ordered his troops inside Kuwait to counterattack against the US Marines. But they couldn't match the Americans' firepower, nor halt their relentless drive towards Kuwait City. However, Saddam still had one last sting in his tail. Iraqi troops fired a Scud missile towards a coalition base in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. The resulting explosion killed 28 Americans, and 100 were left wounded.
Has to go up there.
It was their biggest single loss in the war so far.
"36 hours later, coalition troops led by units from Kuwait's own army arrived in Kuwait City. The streets soon filled with vehicles as people celebrated the end of the Iraqi occupation.
Welcome in Kuwait! Welcome, Mr. Bush! Welcome!
I am pleased to announce that exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
The Gulf War was over. Within weeks, tens of thousands of coalition troops began the long journey home. All of them grateful that the mass casualties they'd feared had never materialized. Schwarzkopf and his men returned home to a hero's welcome. But Saddam's regime did not crumble as the Americans hoped. He crushed two uprisings that followed the end of the war and remained in power for another 12 years. Several thousand US forces remained in Saudi Arabia to keep watch on Saddam's army.